Okay, so if you follow Dutch politics at all, you know it can feel like a constant storm of headlines and controversies. It's a lot. But what if the real story isn't just what politicians are saying, but how they're saying it? To really get what's going on with all this turmoil, we need to listen a little closer, to the power of their words. And this phrase right here from our source material just perfectly captures the mood. It's a rare soap opera. That feeling of nonstop political drama that, for a lot of people, has kind of just become the new normal. So, what does all this chaos, all this drama actually do to the public? Well, according to political historian Professor Henk de Veld, this endless back and forth isn't just background noise. It's actually creating a very specific and, well, a deeply corrosive feeling among voters. So first up, let's talk about the atmosphere this whole thing creates. Professor de Velde points out that the constant maneuvering, the cabinet collapses, the dramatic exits, it's not just entertainment. It's actually fuel for a really profound and growing public cynicism. And what that does is it creates this feeling of just being tired of it all. A new crisis doesn't really shock anyone anymore. It's more like people just kind of sigh and go, well, I guess we'll just add that to the pile. It's the sound of a public that's just worn out by the whole show. But here's where it gets really interesting. What happens in a political landscape that's just defined by chaos and cynicism? Well, an opening appears, an opening for a completely different style of communication. And that brings us to Henri Bontebal of the CDA. Right in the middle of all this noise, he's a politician who's starting to stand out. And it's not just for his policies, but for a rhetorical style that feels like a pretty sharp contrast to the current political climate. So what is it about the way he speaks that's cutting through all that cynicism? Well, Professor de Velde's analysis breaks his style down into two key elements that, frankly, feel particularly powerful right now. First off, he very consciously tries to bring a sense of reasonableness back into the debate, kind of pushing for conversation over just yelling. And second, he weaves in this moral undertone, a sense of right and wrong. But he does it subtly. It doesn't sound like he's up there giving a sermon. And you can hear his whole approach in his own words right here. Bontebal is explicitly positioning himself as the antidote to the daily shouting that's left so many voters just completely exhausted. But you have to wonder, is this calm, moral, but not preachy style a totally new invention? Well, Professor de Velde doesn't really think so. In fact, he draws a pretty fascinating historical line from Bontebal all the way back to another key figure from the CDA's early days. So take a look at this comparison. While Bontebal shares a moral foundation with this key party figure from the 70s, Willem Antius, their delivery is, well, it's worlds apart. Where Bontebal is modern and reasonable, Antius was forceful. And where Bontebal's moral tone is subtle, Antius was super explicit, almost religious. The source describes his style as sounding really like a pastor, which, to be fair, was something that fit perfectly in his era. I mean, you can just feel the power in Anti's language here. It has this almost biblical rhythm to it, a style of speech that was super effective back then, but as Professor de Velde points out, is something Bontebal would almost certainly avoid today. The times have changed, and so has the rhetoric. Okay, so if Bontebal represents this rhetoric of reasonableness, how does that actually fit into the bigger picture? To really get what makes his style pop, we have to see it alongside the other dominant approaches in Dutch politics right now. So first, a couple of quick terms that are absolutely essential here. You've got ethos, which is all about credibility. Either you're building up your own, or more often, you're tearing down your opponents. Then there's pathos, which is a direct appeal to the audience's emotions. Got it? Okay. All right. This is where it all comes together. We can basically map out four major political figures and their signature styles. You've got Geert Wilders' confrontation, Mark Rutte's relatability, and Frans Timmermans' appeal to emotion. Each one uses a different tool, and each really stands in contrast to Bontebal's reasonableness. Let's look at them one by one. So Geert Wilders' main rhetorical weapon is the attack on ethos. His goal is to just completely undermine the authority and character of his opponent. Think of insults like calling another politician a miserable little man. The professor notes that while it might feel kind of like a broken record, it's a tactic that has been consistently effective for him. Then you've got Mark Rutte, especially during a crisis like the pandemic. His style is all about a very calculated relatability. He intentionally tries to shrink the distance between himself as a leader and the public, speaking really informally from his office, which is a huge contrast to the formal, super stately addresses you might see from, say, a French president.
And finally, there's Frans Timmermans, who is a master of pathos, that appeal to emotion. But the source gives us a really fascinating cultural insight here. His powerful speech after the MH17 tragedy would apparently sound unbearably pathetic if you translated it directly into Dutch. It just goes to show you there's a cultural preference for a more subdued emotional style.
So we've seen confrontation, relatability, and emotion. But Professor de Velde argues there's still something really crucial missing from the Dutch political landscape, especially from the politicians who are in the center. The core problem, he suggests, is that a lot of centrist politicians are just too afraid to fail. They avoid taking big rhetorical risks, and they stick to safe, almost managerial language, instead of trying to tell a truly inspiring story or lay out some kind of grand vision for the country. And this really brings us to the key takeaway from the professor's analysis. He believes there is a vacuum now in Dutch politics, a space just waiting to be filled by someone who is willing to risk failure to offer a compelling, uplifting story about the future. So, as this whole political soap opera keeps unfolding, we'll leave you with this question. In a landscape that's so defined by cynicism and really predictable tactics, what is the inspiring story that's just waiting to be told?